This panel was billed as the equity panel, and I'm so thrilled that these questions behind me are what Sahar and I wanted to frame the conversation around. We're going to have a conversation more than a presentation. But I think throughout the morning, you've heard equity come up and inclusion in almost every panel. It's a real tribute to the framing of this conference, because I'm sure most of you have been to Smart Cities conferences in the last couple of years, and so much of it is focused on the technology and what the technology can do and promise us. And this conference is really putting people at the center, I think, and that's what we mean by equity and inclusion. So I encourage you, as you move throughout the conference, I know the theme will continue coming up, but these are really the questions that we have to continuously ask ourselves and challenge our colleagues who are not here to focus on as we move towards smart cities. So when we look at most social policy challenges, it really comes down to these three basic questions. Who's paying? What makes someone deserving if they cannot pay? And what minimum resources should people have by right? I mean, that's really what our political discourse or lack of discourse is about these days. And it's really about the division of scarce resources. And what makes me so excited and why someone in affordable housing is engaged in this smart cities conversation is because I think a shift is happening. And if the smart city evolves as many of us hope it will, the basic economic driver of our economy will be network effects instead of that division of scarce resources. So network effects dictate that the more people that are participating in the network, the more value there is. So it really flips the script, because actually excluding people, not being equitable, not being inclusive, hurts the economy. And that's a totally different game than dividing up these scarce resources. So we're going to get to the Q&A very shortly. But we also felt that not everyone, when they talk about equity and inclusion, is talking about the same thing. And there's the definitions are behind me, but this is a very simple framework, and we've added a third element here, which is access, that I encourage you to think about, as you move throughout the conference, and not just what we mean by those terms, but who it applies to. So often we talk about income or color or race, but there's also obviously disability and age and other groups as well that face a lack of equity or a lack of inclusion. There's also this conversation, and many of you have probably seen some version of this slide, about the difference between equality and equity, treating everyone the same and giving people opportunity for success. So the slide that most people see is this one, where you have three people of different size trying to see over a fence. I like this one better because, for two reasons. It shows that not everyone is starting from the same vantage point. The ground is sloping down. And also, the barrier, the fence, is not the same height for everybody. So I think that's an important framework as well, and a deep discussion that we could go on, and we'll tease it out a little bit in the conversation with Sahar. But I want to talk for just a second about Lauren Scott. So Lauren was featured in the Washington Post 3 years ago, and it's a story about her journey from the homeless shelter where she lives with her daughter to apply for a job in Atlanta. So this journey, and it's not unique to Lauren, is about 2 hours to apply for a job in a warehouse. And she's doing the bus, to the train, to the bus, walking to put in an application for a job that she may not and probably doesn't get. Not to kill the story, because you can read it, and the link is up there. I know everyone's going to get the slides. So for the sake of time, these stories about Lauren and other people who are in poverty, low-income people who face challenges, are really important to understand when we think about the policies that we're shaping. The data is important too, but when you hear a fact like 20% of people are living under the poverty line in a certain region, we mentally connect with that, but we really have to understand the stories that they face. And I encourage you, if you're looking for those stories, two relatively recent books that really capture what people are facing in this country are Evicted by Matt Desmond and I want to get the title right, Not a Crime to be Poor by Peter Edelman. So the first one is about eviction in this country, which is pervasive in every locality. And the second one is about the money bail system that we have in this country and how someone ends up in jail for a broken taillight and many other minor offenses that end up becoming so disruptive to their lives. So with that, we're turning to the interactive portion of this presentation. And Lauren and I are going to have a discussion about these, Sahar, Lauren's my example. I wish she could be here and tell her story. About these 6 topics. It's going to be kind of rapid fire given that we're the last mental appetizer before the actual lunch. So, get this to advance. Okay, there we go. Sahar, nice to see you.
Hi.
Welcome to the conversation. So we're going to talk about these topics. We're going to put some factoids up there. We're not going to go through them, but just we thought some interesting things to ground the conversation in these topics. So you represent the 6th largest economy in the world, so you have to get smart cities right.
No pressure.
So cities are typically the engine of any region's economic activity. What do you see happening due to automation, the gig economy, and increased mobility?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that this has been a really amazing conversation so far. I just have to say I've been to a lot of these in the last year or so, and the concept of labor and jobs has not come up nearly enough. And part of that is due to the nature of those of us who are present here, right? A lot of planners, a lot of policy folks. But it's really important to keep in mind that so many people work in commerce and in driving and in transportation. And as we talk about these new technologies and how they're going to shift our systems, we also really have to think about how they're going to shift our employment base and the way that we do business in cities. So I don't know exactly what the change will be. I don't think anyone does, but we know it's going to be dramatic, and we know that we need to start talking about it, figuring it out together.
So you mentioned jobs and potentially displacement. As planners and policymakers are thinking about adopting smart city technology and programs, structures, should they be taking displacement, job displacement into account?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I want to shift the word from displacement into possibly a different terminology, because we're not necessarily talking. I mean, we are talking about people losing certain jobs, but we're not necessarily talking about making people unemployed. If we start working together right now with cities, with transit agencies, with nonprofits and advocacy groups that are located within our regions, thinking about this work, and especially with labor unions who really need to be a lot more present at the table, I think, we can shift the jobs we have. So I think one of the things I had mentioned when Nico and I originally talked about this panel is that we were often really focused on protecting the job, and we should actually be focused on protecting the employee. And how do we ensure that they have a transition and training and a pathway to a different job in the future?
Okay, well, let's shift to commerce then, our second topic in rapid fire. So this is really interesting. I will point to this. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but Amazon is offering a discounted Prime service if you're the recipient of electronic benefit transfers, EBT or Medicaid, which is pretty interesting. So how do you view that? What is the impact of someone like Amazon offering this?
Yeah, this is really interesting to me too, because until you told me, I didn't know this either. And I think often when we think about the change and the disruption in commerce, we're thinking about what was mentioned in the previous panel about shops closing down, retail centers shifting in style, and what that does to cities and communities. And I think that's really important to consider. But there's also this effect of providing additional access to goods for people. And part of the problem has traditionally been that there's populations that are unbanked, that don't use technology in the same way. And I think we're still going to run into a lot of those issues with something like this. However, it does increase the ability of certain populations to access certain goods, and especially with Amazon teaming up with other industries. I'm thinking about, I live in Oakland, California, where we have massive food deserts, and just the opportunity to have fresh food in some places is in itself a benefit. I don't think it's a solve all for the issues that we have, but it's a nice step in the right direction. I do want to just say one more thing about the shift in commerce, though, before we move on. I know we're trying to go fast. But I think that, even as we close retail centers, as places in more suburban areas are experiencing the loss of retail and very dramatic effects that has. I think in a lot of these situations, if we can shift our conversation a little bit towards what opportunities may be present there, because we're looking at space, right? We're looking at losing retail, but increasing the availability of space to do maybe more things like creating a community that people can access equitably and want to be in, maybe more affordable housing, maybe more paths or recreation activities. So there are opportunities being presented there as well.
Great. So let's shift to housing. So when we talk about housing in the smart city, so much of housing is driven by what you can afford, and we do have programs that help people bridge that gap. But as you can see, only about 20% of households who are eligible for some kind of support actually get it. And if you get it, you're not exactly able to use it because in many states, 25 states, source of income is not protected. So a landlord can deny you if you have a Section 8 voucher, for example, or a veteran's housing voucher. So how does this change in the smart city if the parking elements that we heard before about being reduced by even 50, 60%, let's say, does land get revalued? How does California approach that?
Well, California has an interesting system of a lot of local control, so I'll speak a little more generally about it instead. I think that there's tremendous opportunity to be presented, and we are thinking pretty far into the future here. I mean, depending on whether you believe the 5-year or 20-year scenario, regardless, for full penetration and for us to really have a whole system where we're looking at retaking parking spaces or retaking lanes, we are talking a bit into the future. But the benefit of that is we have time to plan for it, right? So we have time to think about what will we do with all those spaces, those empty parking lots that honestly currently are pretty empty already. And thinking about how to create programs that incentivize us using those to build more affordable housing, especially in the more dense urban centers that require it. Because as everyone has mentioned here today, and that's another thing I was really excited to hear everyone talk about, is we are suburbanizing poverty. And as we continue to do so and make it more or less affordable to live in urban centers, we really have to think about how to densify and how to allow better access to people with lower incomes of the activities in those centers. We've built cities for a long time to address all the needs of people at different income levels, and now we're pushing them out of the cities, and we aren't giving them transportation options to get to those centers anymore. So we're creating a lot of problems, and this is sort of an opportunity to address some of those, I think.
So if someone like Lauren Scott is able to move closer to that warehousing job, if she gets the job, does that mean in a smart city scenario with autonomous vehicles and multimodal transportation that the gentrification challenges we face in Portland and San Francisco and DC, Boston goes away?
Oh, I doubt that. I think that that's going to be a continuing challenge for us as we continue to grow, as income levels continue to shift between different populations. I think we have to address it holistically on multiple levels, but I do think this is one of them. And I would say that the land use and transportation pieces of this really go very closely together. I think they're inextricably linked, because if we talk about building more housing, that's excellent, but we also have to talk about how to get people that can't live in that housing still back to the centers where they need to be.
Okay, let's talk about health. So, how does the smart city change health outcomes, especially for low-income people?
So, as with many of these areas that we're talking about, I think there's opportunities and there's probably a lot of fears as well. And I really like this chart in particular because it talks about all the different factors that go into health. In California, we have a health in all policies policy, and we look at everything through a health and a health equity lens in particular. And so when we're talking about creating smart cities, if we are inclusive, if we think about the needs of different types of people, as well as the needs of different types of transportation, right? A lot of people's only daily activity is walking to the bus. If we remove that, we're creating massive health problems. We're exacerbating massive health problems. If we use the data that we have and we really think about how to plan a city that's inclusive for everyone, we can help increase physical activity, increase opportunities for recreation, and increase access to nutritious opportunities as well.
So we're going to have a tremendous amount of data available to us for things like air quality, these remote sensors that are going on, the lighting systems, et cetera. Is it going to be too much, though, to act on for issues like health?
I don't think it's too much. I do think that it's a bit overwhelming to a lot of cities right now. I've been in a lot of these conversations where cities are asking companies for data, and when the company says, well, what do you want to use it for? They say, we just want the data, which is understandable. But at the flip side of that token, if we start with the outcome that we're trying to get to, if we start with the value that we're presenting and say, this is the problem I'm trying to address, or this is the goal I'm trying to get to, and here's the data I need for it, I think that's a lot simpler of a case to make. Because we are creating insane amounts of data, so it's there. We just need to figure out how to use it right.
Okay, our last meaty topic before lunch, infrastructure. All right, let's cut to the chase. How do we think about universal service for critical infrastructure when more and more things are critical?
Yeah, I think that we have to have a really realistic conversation about prioritization and about what we're trying to do, both at a city level, at a regional level, at a state level. What is the goal that we're trying to achieve? And that conversation needs to be focused on people rather than vehicles, and that conversation needs to include the people that we're focusing on. I think we've done a lot of public outreach in the past, and we haven't done a ton of public engagement. What we want to do is really talk to the people that we're trying to serve and find out what their needs are and start there and work backwards to how to get there. And that's how we can use the best, or make the best use of our very limited dollars that are increasingly limited.
So very last question. I heard 2 panels ago that car purchases are increasing in LA County, and I think I interpreted that it's because more low-income people are buying cars because now they can get access to them. Cars are cheaper, maybe better credit, whatever the reason might be. So they're now getting access to that freedom. How do we assure that the poorest people in communities, as wealthier people move to the smart city, are not left behind with the older technologies?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, both in terms of the technology and infrastructure, but also in terms of environmental justice issues. And this is sort of what started us down this path on equity, is thinking about, not only where will the city invest and put in the infrastructure and access, but also what happens to those old cars? What happens to the port areas that have already been removed from the city center, already have bad air quality impacts, and now they have access to really polluting vehicles as well, which on the one hand, they may need to be able to get to that job that's only 10 miles away but takes 2 hours, but on the other hand, it increases the health disparities of their communities. So I think this goes back to that public engagement piece and really trying to do the planning for the future with the communities that we have in mind. I think there is an assumption amongst a lot of people that this will be better on its own, and that assumption itself leaves a lot of people out. When we talk about the transportation system and the land use system we've created, it's already inequitable. So if we put a new system, as better or as great as it may be, on top of an existing inequitable system, we're just going to exacerbate the existing inequities. So we really have to think about it differently. I like the way that Susan framed it this morning, is we really do have to think about everything differently. And that seems unobtainable, but if we start with the visions we have and include everyone in the process, I think we can get there, or at least get closer.
Great. Well, Sahar, we had a 12:15 ETA. It is now 12:15. I will say there is a equity and inclusion panel happening right after lunch where we'll go a little bit deeper if you're interested. Oh, we can take questions. Wonderful. Well, hopefully your stomachs aren't rumbling too much. We do have one question coming to the mic.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the commerce issue and ask you about the role that these large-scale companies have in the equity conversation. Companies like Amazon and Google have really reached a sort of unprecedented scale. Usually when companies get this big, they sort of break apart and become smaller pieces. But we're seeing Amazon, for instance, and these large companies starting to function almost as small governments. And you see that especially with Amazon partnering with JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway on their healthcare strategy, where they're providing healthcare for their employees. I'm wondering if there's a new sense of responsibility for these large companies in the equity conversation and kind of supplying these assets to their employees. And do you see that responsibility being brought to the conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I don't know if responsibility is the word I would use. I mean, I think that I would like to morally think of it as a responsibility, but I don't work at any of those companies, so I don't know if that's the way that they would frame it. I will say that I think there is a bit of power in the city structure and the government structure to create a situation where it's financially beneficial for those companies to do some of the things we want them to do. So in terms of transportation, it's thinking about the way we price right-of-way or curb space, et cetera. But there's opportunities in housing, there's opportunities in retail to create a structure that when the companies come in, regardless of how big they may be and how they do business elsewhere, they're doing business in our community the way that we want them to. And this is especially prominent in cities where there's a lot of demand for that type of retail. So a lot of urban centers and mega regions that are building up, they have a lot of power on how they allow people to do business in their community. And I think sometimes they forget that because it's so exciting to have people wanting to come into your city. And even, honestly, in California, where property tax is an issue and we're really dependent on sales tax revenue, I think cities are often allowing companies to come in very quickly. But there is a movement, I think, among some cities to do that. Use your power to create an environment where the morals and the qualities that you want are incentivized for the companies.
I want to be equitable here and just take one quick question from the other mic.
Thanks. So you started out with this idea of the network effect, and as we've been talking about equity, I've heard a lot of focus on sort of the concessionary side about how folks should be allowed access to see over the fence through different pathways. I wonder if you have any thoughts on sort of promising practices around having folks from diverse backgrounds, low-income backgrounds, et cetera, contribute to the solution set as well. So these micro-entrepreneurship models, things like that are going to evolve in the city. Do we need to rely on Google and Amazon to do all of that and offer a concessionary access path? Or are you seeing other things that might open up the way that our cities evolve to hear more voices and draw on more brains?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of engagement models happening throughout the country that are really promising, and that's a bit of a longer-term version of getting to where you're talking about. I will actually even point to myself as one of these cases, because I think that when we start to see people that represent our values and look more like us on these decision-making teams, it starts to become more of a possibility and a reality. So I think doing more engagement with the public, with the communities in their space, in their time, listening to them and not just telling them what's best for them, as well as doing more education and outreach through traditional systems. I think that's sort of our longer-term path towards there. I don't know that I have a quick solution, unfortunately, but I think having these conversations is the first step towards that, and acknowledging that we've made a lot of mistakes, acknowledging that our transportation system destroyed cities in its creation, and predominantly cities where there were communities of color involved, acknowledging that a lot of our transportation system was built without thinking about women's needs, for example. So really just starting that conversation and then focusing on getting more people that have experienced those particular experiences in the room, talking about it and being a part of the decision-making process.
Great. Thank you, Sahar. Thank you, everyone.